but just to give a bit of an overview of what we're doing here. So my name is Barry Cranford. I run a number of different tech communities in London. So one of those communities is the London CTOs, and every week we have a CTO lunch club, and you've got a different host each week, hosts a bunch of different things on all sorts of different topics, sometimes panels and sometimes directly. Turntable are one of the companies that we work with, and we were just talking there about, wouldn't it be nice if we had a very similar thing that was specifically aimed at financial services technology, and that became the FS Tech Coffee Club, which is what we're doing here. So the idea is just to bring a bunch of different people, specialists in a certain area, to talk about something within financial services technology, and at the same time to exchange details, meet a few new people in the area, and really kick off some conversations here. So we'll be sending out a document shortly on the chat, so you can put in your LinkedIn details if you'd like, and if you'd like to connect with the panel here. The rest is going to be hosted by Sam from Turntable. So Sam, if you're ready, take it away.
Born ready, mate. Yes, thank you very much, Barry, and thanks everyone for joining us. We've hosted, I think this is our 5th FS Tech Coffee Club now, and they're always really, really good fun. So I think you should look forward to for the next hour is really interesting and in-depth conversation with some very friendly, knowledgeable faces. Fairly kind of low stakes environment. So we're very, very happy for people to come off mute and ask questions and make comments. If you don't want to do that, drop a message in the chat and I'll pick it up. I can see there's 5 there already, so I'm going to go in there in a second. The topic for today is observability. And, my background, I've been a software developer for a long time, and I've run software teams in various places. And I used to have a rule when people checked in code. If I saw someone logging at the error level, I wanted to charge them £10 from their salary, because and Carly and James and John on our panel haven't heard me tell this story before, but it's true, right? I was never allowed to, but I wanted to charge them £10 because log.error usually wakes someone up, and I wanted people to think about what they were doing when they were logging. Now, like many of my ideas, that one didn't land. But I want to introduce our panel, and then we're going to dive straight into this question of what's changed between logging and observability. Like, what did logging lack? Why was the data collection not enough? What's the difference between a system that logs and one that's truly observable? And what does the state of the world look like now? So I'll ask John and then James and then Carly to introduce themselves, who you are, where you've been, and then we'll get right into that question.
Hi, Sam. I'm John Freedman. So I'm a fractional CTO. I work with hedge funds and asset managers who need the tech to scale without slowing them down. I run technology across front, middle, and back office at firms like Millennium, Point72, Brevin Howard. So I've seen what works and what just eats up time and money.
Well, John.
Great. I'm James Davidson, and I currently, I'm head of infrastructure, and my background has basically been application support and infrastructure over the last 20 years. I've worked at buy side and sell side, so the likes of JP Morgan, Barclays, and also a spin out from a hedge fund, and also a sovereign wealth fund in the Middle East. So I've seen a lot of infrastructure and application teams, support teams, try and implement observability across the last 15 years. And obviously there's many different rights and wrongs. And I think obviously we'll lead into conversation about, what we believe has worked and what we've learned from the mistakes along the way. So back to you.
Cheers, James. I will say that when we had the prep call for this discussion, I think we found that we're quite an opinionated group of people. So which I think is the best way to do things, right? So Carly, let's go on to you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sam. Hi, everybody. So my name's Carly Richmond. I lead the developer advocate team in DevRel at Elastic. So it's a fun part of my job that I get to talk and geek out about observability and search topics. I do have a financial services connection because before I joined Elastic, I worked at Morgan Stanley for 10 years in back office functions in regulatory and treasury and application infrastructure. I, for most of that time, was a front-end engineer, so I love front-end topics as well as observability. So I have some very strong opinions about how we do that wrong, and I'm happy to share mistakes that I've made along the way and how I would, if I could go back in time, do things a bit differently.
Brilliant, Carly. Welcome and thanks for being on the panel. Let's just go straight back to you then and start with the move from time-stamped log messages to multi-signal, multi-access queryable events. How have we gotten there?
Yeah, so I think part of it is through competing tools and standards. So I guess people might want to chime in if they've heard of OpenTelemetry or not, but for me, that's where I started to understand that this notion of a signal as a piece of information. I think historically we've always thought that logging was the only mechanism to share information, and that was part of the reason why we ended up sharing information very badly. So when I used to work in some functions, I come from the days when we had logging and you had to SSH into the box. We had some alerts, but I was getting them in my email inbox to the extent I came back from 6 months on maternity leave and I couldn't open Outlook because the cache was so big, and it was all from all of these logging and problematic issues that we were sending to people's inboxes instead. Because I think we didn't, it comes back to that point you said at the start, Sam, that idea of we didn't really think about the fact that it had a ramification and we were waking somebody up. And I think we didn't think about, as application engineers, the fact that there was a ramification to sending this particular error message. We just thought something might go wrong at this point, so we should probably send it somewhere. And we didn't really know what to do with it. And I think we're bad at teaching people the best practices of logging and what constitutes waking someone up at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I think also that has led to this emergence of, well, we can't rely on these structured messages anymore. We need other telemetry information that can potentially be thresholded, that can allow us to really understand and pick up perhaps automatically and in smarter ways what's going on without having someone stare at a screen 24 hours a day. So that combined with these different technologies that differed for infrastructure, differed for web, differed for front end, differed for back end, the emergence of open standards and open tooling that can be used at any layer, that can also send in a common schema and basically send off the telemetry and establish best practices. So OpenTelemetry is an established incubation level project that has brought forward these things. It's actually a merge of competing standards, so Open Census being the main one and Open Tracing being the other one. And it's a community-led focus that allows us to think about these different types of data in a way that is standard. So all the people here that were saying they wanted to learn about best practices and best way of doing it, the advantage of these capabilities is it's agnostic across different ecosystems and different industries, which it should be. What I do see is, despite the fact we got these different types of signals, people are still relying on logging very heavily because it is an easy and quick way to understand that something has potentially blown up. And it's in a way that's, we can understand as humans. But I think that's partially because we don't always necessarily invest enough time in capturing metrics. So like quantifiable numbers that actually say, hey, things are starting to trend the wrong way. And also tracing, which can show us the pathway of execution through complex components and microservices. And I think we just need to get a bit better at adding that stuff on, because logging is easy. Everyone has to use a logger, but you have to think a bit more about adding in like an OTel agent or something that's going to capture these other measures. But I don't know. What does the rest of the panel think?
Yeah,
Can I?
James, you've got some more stories. That's
Yeah,
good for you.
so I think I mean, what Carly just mentioned, the logs, metrics, and traces. I think the piece obviously about, logging is just not enough. Without all three, you're quite often guessing when you have incidents. And obviously the premise is that observability requires on that correlation, of the different signals to give you a more complete picture. And I think if I think about some of those kind of classic real life examples is, an application crashes, the log tells you the app was throwing errors, as you alluded to earlier, Sam. And I think obviously it's throwing errors, but at the same time, the CPU is high or there's connectivity errors. And that doesn't really tell you that information from the log. So ultimately, we need to make sure we've got all these three telemetry signals from the logs, the metrics, and the traces. You know, observability is about kind of understanding those unknowns. And you've got, you know, why is this request slow? You know, where is the failure happening? What part of the system is degraded? And that's, you know, I see it as really important that you don't just think logging's enough. Anyway, there we go.
Can you try? Well, John, I'll come to you. The signal that I'm receiving from John is when he goes. Can you draw? Is this simple as being able to draw a timeline from when developers like me would write log messages and they would log locally, and then Splunk was like a better log collector, and then once we realized that getting everything in one place was good, we got more in one place. Is it as simple as that?
But you're also having to correlate those IDs across your traces, across your metrics, and I guess the correlation of those signals are going to come from your business context. You know, what is it, the problem on the business side that actually is the signal that's telling you what's wrong?
Right. John, what have you got to say?
I think the move to deploying on cloud and claiming you can write cloud native code is a driver for this as well. So when I think back to my first few jobs, everything was on premise. You had some servers, they were running Linux, they could have uptime that ran into the years, they just worked. And if your code broke, it was because there was a bug in your code that you'd written. When you start deploying onto the cloud, when you have those microservice architectures or just some services and more than 2 or 3 boxes on an architecture diagram, then you need to think about, how do I manage this system? Because your customers, whoever they are, don't care how simple or complex your platform is. They just care if it's working or not. And you introduce these complexities with cloud or microservices, you need to know whether it's working or not, and when it's not working, which bit broke.
I think that point on which bit broke is quite important, because I remember being a front-end engineer, and quite often the escalation would come to me first because a user doesn't, as you say, understand which component or which piece is broken. Their feedback is, well, this number is wrong, or this screen's not showing any data, or this is all red, what's going on? So quite often it would come to me first as the escalation for kind of like level 3 off the back of a support query. And then it was me that had to go and figure it out. And, you know, when you have to, you know, SSH into several boxes and look at every single set of logs and component and try and understand what's fallen over because you have no general visibility of what's up or down, that makes it a really time-consuming process. But a lot of these tools now give us very simple views of like red, green status, so we can tell very quickly through these notion of measures which component has fallen over, where are the logs for that one compared to that other one. And it's just all kind of back to that point that was mentioned about kind of Splunk and observability platforms. Everything's in the one place. So it's easy to find without having to do that kind of game of hopping between the different boxes and figuring it out. So the microservice and the, you know, cloud component is definitely a big driver. I would agree with that, John.
So, like, one of the big like names in the OpenTelemetry space is Yuri Shakura, right? Who, like, I know from my Morgan Stanley days, and he was, my understanding, is working at Uber at the time, like the canonical many microservice architecture, right? So I think a lot of the OpenTelemetry and a lot of the observability space are just coming from people building the tools that they need to do their jobs, right? James, I know that, you know, one of the big thoughts is like, how do you start to build your observability architecture? It's like, do you start from the technology and the platforms and the hardware that you have, or do you start from the business processes? Like, so how do you go about defining the metrics that help you support a business?
Yeah, I probably should dig into the past here, and because I came from an application support background, we very much had the kind of application server ecosystem. This is, you know, even before cloud days, but we very much assumed that, you know, the infra was done separately and was reliable, and until it went wrong and it took out multiple apps, you know, that's obviously when you start to think, well, hang on, we need to do things a bit differently here. And when I entered the infrastructure space, I actually realized that, you know, the network monitoring, some of the server monitoring, some of the database monitoring was all done separate, and there was no cohesion amongst the infrastructure. And I guess what you then realize fast forward a few more years, the tech teams have always been focused obviously on the tech, as opposed to, and coming from the application, we were sitting on trading floors and we were always talking to the traders. So a lot of our application monitoring and alerting was all driven by their context, their business challenges and their problems. And, you know, doing that root cause analysis of those business problems that you had outages with. So when I came together and started to take over infrastructure teams, I realized that, you know, we needed to talk more and understand the business. And that's when I said, right, hang on a second, let's work out what the problems we're trying to problems we're trying to solve from a business perspective, and have their lens on what they see as customer, you know, impacting for them. So, you know, what business are we in? And obviously financial services, we were executing orders and settling trades, etc. You know, what signals would they be caring about? You know, is my trade late for settlement? Is my execution or order not executing in the market? You know, is it missing market data? Whatever those signals are. And, you know, you do still obviously need to define your SLOs and SLIs to make sure that you're able to see where things go wrong and you can alert to systems. But I'd say that the business use cases affect, you know, the tools that you go for. Start with your, what is the business doing? So we started the sovereign wealth fund I was talking about. We actually started with some NAV and LIBOR processes, and it was really just start of day what they expected to be given by some of their custodians, and also the data across the organization, the position data. And actually, all we needed to do was look at the, you know, when the files were, or whatever they were arriving, the data points, and making sure that you were capturing when they needed to come in. If there was obviously a delay, then obviously throw an exception. And that was given to the business to start with, and then obviously the tech teams took it over. So I think there's a number of use cases, but request, you know, for example, instrument creation, a certain time frame. Traders need to make sure their instruments are set up before they can trade them. They might be able to trade them, but they might not be able to get the right data to their positions because they're not set up properly. And I think going back to the observability point, you know, start from the problem, get the signals in to do the analysis, and that's how you're able to start resolving. It is very business speak, but I think you can relate this to any industry you're in. It doesn't matter what sector you're in. Ultimately, you know, financial services is, I guess John and I were used to sort of fast-paced environments where you had to be quick, and the post-mortems were done very quickly, and suddenly you were adding in an extra sort of 5 or 10 alerts to be, or monitoring to be captured into alerts.
I guess there's this like industry standard best practice in the software
Yeah.
development space where we go to our users early on and ask them what they want.
Yeah.
You know, and that was a reaction to this waterfall model where we would do that and then we'd leave for 6 months and come back with a software product which was no longer what anybody needed, right? So I guess, Carly, when you're speaking to your customers from the vendor side, what's the best practice? How did you work with developers to understand the business flow? And is it different from the software space?
So I think Agile development has done some good things and some bad things on this, because by all means we need to work. I know that might be controversial. As a former Scrum Master, I'm saying this with a level of confidence. It's done some good things with regards to greater engagement, quicker turnaround, and that kind of faster to market competitive edge that you kind of alluded to when you talked about going away for 6 months and then coming back and realizing, oh, what you asked for 6 months is actually not what we built, or all those kind of problems. It's led to a situation where actually sometimes we're too busy focused on features and not focused on the observability and what actually needs to go in, which quite often means that I see people off the back of an outage panicking that they want to put in observability stuff outside of logs. They've had a particular story or a particular instance where, like, we couldn't figure this out because the logs weren't enough. And I've been there. I've been the person that sees a huge out of memory log error. And I'm like, well, that tells me nothing. I actually need to go down the route of profiling and seeing within the state of the heap and the objects what's happened there. Or I've got issues with CPU mode, so I need to know what the measures are. What I tend to see is it does depend on language ecosystem, but a lot of people want to use OpenTelemetry because it is vendor agnostic, and that therefore gives you an element of flexibility, because obviously as long as it's, you know, production prime time considered stable, and that does depend on the language SDK you're talking about, you can add something in sometimes, particularly in Java, automatic instrumentation where they just need to add a flag onto a component, and then it will give them a baseline of telemetry that they don't have to think about so much. It
Mhm.
does feel like a tick box exercise, but then they can look at what's being generated and then start to form an idea of that's enough, is that sufficient? And then if they need to do anything custom, then obviously you've got the SDK to add those capabilities in as well. So I tend to always recommend starting off with automatic instrumentation, capture all three logs, metrics, and traces, and then see how you go. But I do still speak to a lot of people in varying different ecosystems that they might have heard of OpenTelemetry, they might have heard of these different tools, and some of them are very established and adopted in using metrics and tying them to service level objectives and all these other things. But then you still have the opposing people playing catch up who are reliant on just logs all the time, and that ecosystem is still there, which is a little bit scary.
There's definitely a culture piece, isn't there, which I want to come and speak to John to in a second. But just before we do that, I just want to remind the folks in the audience, if they have questions for the panel, they can drop those in the chat. If you are more polite than that, you can use the raise hand feature in Zoom, but please don't feel like you have to. If you want to take part in a robust discussion, please do just come off mute and yell into the void, and we'll pick up what you got to say. Just like I said, we do these all the time, and the more people take part, the more fun it is for everyone involved. But given that, I do want to speak to John about building developer culture and developer tooling around observability best practices. And I guess the best place to start would be like, what does good look like?
Well, I'll flip that and talk about bad maybe. So I hired a lot of people in 2023. I built up a fairly large department at lightning speed, and it surprised me how few people knew about OpenTelemetry and custom metrics in particular. So I've been reflecting on maybe why and how you fix that. Part of me thinks that unless you've been responsible for a real-time system and you felt the impact of checking in something that was going to add a new feature or fix something that broke something else, you don't quite understand why this is not nice to have, but actually critical. Because if you're doing an overnight batch and it takes a bit longer, you're like, oh, well, that's a shame. As long as it was still done in time, well, we'll come back to that in 6 months and speed it up by 20 minutes. But with that real-time loop, if you're trying to go at a certain speed and you go 1 second longer than you used to, then pretty quickly it starts adding up. And then your system's broken. And you get into this loop of, oh, let's just restart it. We're in the middle of the trading day. Let's restart this. Oh no, let's restart it again. You're on a whole day outage call. You've restarted your production processes 12 times. And then you're like, okay, what do we do to stop this happening tomorrow? And then if you're really lucky, it was a transient failure and it goes away. So that's the bad. And I'd ask people in interview questions what building a modern observable system meant to them and got all sorts of different answers. But tying it back to your business, what is it that you are building? How are you doing it, and how do you measure whether it works or not? That underpins good, because you translate the things that your business care about into rules or things that you measure. And in finance, we're used to being pretty direct about this. If your business is happy and making money and you deliver a good service, then you get paid. And if they're not happy, then you don't. So the incentives are there for people to build this stuff in, but a lot of them don't know about it. And what I want an answer for, and maybe there isn't one size fits all answer, is how to get that culture into a team without everybody having to have been woken up once at 3 o'clock in the morning and trying to figure this stuff out.
I once started so war story time. I once started a script that did some work in production. I was living in Hong Kong, started the script. I went to the airport, jumped on a plane, landed in London 13 hours later, went into the office. Everyone's on fire. People are running around, hair on fire. Some idiot ran a script in production overnight and it took everything down. Who did that? Does anyone know who did that? No, we don't know who did. Okay, phew, let's have a look. A tight loop opening a file and I forgot to close the file. So the script just chewed up all the file handles on a production box and died. And that's the Java 101. That's the first thing they teach you when they teach you how to open files, and I did it. But I did get paid. So
we didn't have blameless postmortems back then either, did we?
Didn't have blameless postmortems. No, they're going to hang you from the nearest tree. Yeah, I think there's a lot of work to be done in developer culture. Maybe John, like how much tooling support do you get when you move to a cloud first architecture, like to a cloud native architecture? Is OpenTelemetry all built in these days?
Well, if you've ever been to one of Amazon, I'm going to pick on Amazon. You've ever been to one of Amazon's events, you'll see multiple vendors, including Elastic, selling versions of what Amazon claim to have themselves. So in a sense, it is built in, but it's not great. And when we talk about developer experience or just experience, it's a big thing with lots of data in it that's not very easy to work with. So Elastic, Datadog, various others, there's open source systems like Prometheus and Grafana. They're about being able to build dashboards that move you away from someone staring at a screen all the time, but allow that person to jump into a screen and check something and put that human pattern recognition on top of the rules-based stuff that you have running all the time. So when you can build a dashboard, it's got lots of charts with things moving up and down. I think as Carly alluded to before, you can monitor that stuff. So has it increased or decreased a lot? Has it gone above a certain value? These platforms will give you machine learning style anomaly detection as well. That's trying to warn you before your users have noticed that something's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But unless you're all-seeing and a complete genius, you're always going to hit that problem where it's broken. Okay, what do we know? And having dashboards and the metrics available that are correlated across time, that's how you jump onto one of those incidents quickly and get the context into the people who have to deal with it as fast as possible.
So what's the good news though, right? So I just got one question, James, and then I want to hear from you about the infra perspective. What's the good news, right? So you've built teams and you've built product that uses more and more observability and increases best practice and uses platforms that have observability baked in. Like, how has observability helped you either solve a problem in production or get closer to you being able to apply your experience and your knowledge of being a software developer to solve a problem?
There's one piece where your non-production environment you can observe better and you have a wider sort of view on it than you would before. So that sort of worst case scenario I mentioned before, you're building a thing, you're focused on testing the thing. As soon as the thing works, you want to release it. But if you're also getting alerts that you deployed it to UAT 3 hours ago and all of these alarms have started going off, if somebody else or an automated system, or even if it is just you, as long as you remember, somebody checks that environment versus production and you can visibly see something's changed, you can catch things at the last minute. Once it's there, I don't like, if I'm managing an incident, asking people questions that I feel pretty strongly they should be able to answer and getting crickets back. So custom metrics for me are how you do that. You're talking about processing orders. Go back 20 years, you write the code to like get order, process order, and you're done. Now you just wrap that in 2 lines of code to tell you how long it took to process the order. That's the knowledge of OpenTelemetry that we need to get into developers' heads, but it's not crazy. You're not writing hundreds of lines of code. It's like people have written easy frameworks to do this. Do some dependency injection, get the thing that does the metrics, wrap your function around that, and you're done.
So it shouldn't be a huge cost. There should be the OpenTelemetry should be baked into platform, into middleware, in Spring, and then a little bit to Carly's point with your specific tracing, maybe if you need to add on top. James, what's your perspective? You jumped in before.
Yeah, you talked a bit about their costs. So, I mean, the barriers to OpenTelemetry are obviously having the right people with the skill sets. That's one thing, but there's a lack of lack of support still these days. We put it in at the organization I was at in the Middle East, and we opened it up for developers to effectively use to log all their lines of code. Sorry, send their logs to and all their traces and metrics to OpenTel. And then we hook that into actually a well-known product, Dynatrace, but you could use Datadog or other tools. And actually, that was a great stepping stone for kind of developers knowing that that's where they send their stuff, and it's all in one place, and it kind of becomes a bit more standardized. There are obviously other ways of standardizing, but I think the barriers, you've got storage of a lot of data potentially if it's a large organization and sending a lot of systems. And then I think the one piece that I kind of wanted to talk off the back of John's points is, if you've standardized a lot of your monitoring into code, and now let's talk about observability as code. When you have a conversation with the business that a certain application didn't go out or changes didn't go out because we haven't set it up in our observability space, you kind of have a better conversation with the business. Why hasn't this gone out? Because it's not operationally ready yet. We haven't got all the tick boxes done from a monitoring and observability perspective. And I think you have a stronger argument to say that it hasn't gone out, or we haven't released that change now because we haven't got it properly observed. And that's the point I wanted to make around kind of the cultural piece as well. The business will accept that. Okay, fine. So you don't have all those signals yet. Yeah.
There's kind of a conversation around the maturity curve of adoption of observability, right? Like you might compare it to something like unit testing or CI/CD, in that these technology shifts have come along and they've made a large change in the quality of our output, our ability to create product, and that product's ability to be performant and stay functional. And if I've had conversations with users on a desk about, we can't release the product because we haven't finished testing it yet.
Yeah.
And that's sometimes been quite a challenging conversation. And the cliche, particularly in financial services, the cliche has been, to hell with testing, let's get it out, we need to be in the market. And is it the same conversation with observability? Can you really bring that to clients and say we're not ready because we can't monitor?
Sorry, probably more for Carly, I guess.
No, I'd agree. I think that's one of the things that we tend to be scared of. So I remember being the engineer that didn't want to have these awkward conversations, but arguably a feature being observable should be part of your definition of done. It should be included under factors like unit testing, etc. But sometimes observability and adding it in is either added in as a last minute asset off the back of, oh, sugar, this is going into production in a day and we haven't got observability on this. We should do something now so that we can see what's going on. Or sometimes it's not even added at all and we wait until a huge incident. Because another factor we need to consider with these things is, if you're adding in a technology, you should still validate and test it's going to work. So I have a story from years ago where support teams were adding app dynamics onto Java components that we were using. And there was an issue an outage in production, we rolled back all the production changes from the weekend. The issue is still happening. And it turns out it was because of headers being added by App Dynamics onto the requests, which were getting bounced off of mainframe queues. So you need to make sure, yeah, I know. We think of observability as something that's going to give us visibility in production, but it's like any other asset. It's any other technology dependency that needs to be tested. So we
Yeah.
need to shift that mindset away from it's a last thing on the checklist before we go into production to this is actually an asset that's part of your application ecosystem that you have to test. So it needs to be changed in developers' heads that they need to add it in a feature from the start and not as a last minute panic situation like going through a security review, which arguably should be earlier in the cycle too.
But you've touched on a couple of things there. Like one is like, can you just bolt on observability at the end? And I think, you know, anybody that's been in the technology space for any length of time has heard that about, to your point, security or testing or UI UX or CI/CD. Like, and the answer should be no. And there's definitely a developer maturity thing there. And then the second thing is like, can you speak to your users and describe observability in a way which is compelling for them, for which they would see an advantage, maybe even before the outage happens?
Yeah, and I guess that comes back to, I think it was John that made the point about the notion of being able to see how long it takes for key processing stages in a trade life cycle to go through, because that's a measure that's of interest to users. And you can make the argument then of saying, well, I'm going to capture these measures which are useful for you for seeing how effective your system is and is it doing the right thing for you. You can make that argument, I'd argue, in some ways easier than some of the other things that we've talked about that we still consider essential.
Yeah. Yeah. I okay, I think it's the time in the day where we ought to talk about AI. So everyone take a deep breath, right? We'll get it over and done with. But Carly, just to come back to you, now that you're taking a sip of water, perfect timing, good hosting. From the vendor space, because maybe you have the view across customer sites, and then we'll speak to John, and then we'll speak to James, because everyone's got an opinion. Where are we at with AI in observability? Because I've got one client story. I speak to clients in technology and financial services, and there's one person I know who owns operations in a large bank, and he has built an AI outage spotter. And it takes all of the feeds and they look back over history and he says, that was an outage, that was an outage, that was an outage. And it's pretty good. What's the space look like right now?
So there's three things I can think of. So firstly, you need to look at your data and probably similar to what he's doing within his outage detector, you need to be looking and identifying outlier patterns in the data. And most tools have had this capability for several years, even before AI and ChatGPT and Gen AI became the things that we don't stop talking about. It's anomaly detection, which John had mentioned before, which basically uses machine learning models on top of your data to find the outliers. And you can use that to be alerted of potential outage situations or look back in the past and correlate those types of information. The second thing is using large language models within observability platforms, similar to chatbots and assistants. And most observability tools, including Elastic, have assistants that might fit within observability tools. And they can allow you to kind of ask quick questions on top of the data to find particular events quickly. But they can quite often be coupled with things like knowledge bases, similar to RAG, retrieval augmented generation architectures, where it combines the answers generated and grounds it against things like your run books and things. So if you have particular steps that you want people to do off the back of an error, the assistant can correlate those things together. And when they're in, the analyst is engaging with it, they can see what's happening. And then the third piece is, quite frankly, if you've built an application using Gen AI capabilities, how do you observe the thing? Every single vendor's got particular capabilities that might hook into OpenTelemetry or associated technology. So there's things like OpenLLMetry, which is a mouthful to say, or OpenLit or other things like that, that will give you information on things like prompts, token counts, and other useful metrics so you can understand what your application's actually doing when it's making the appropriate calls out to an LLM or whichever model provider you're using. So that's probably the three main categories that fit into the Gen AI thing with observability.
The first one's really interesting to me. The second is, I think, table stakes. The third seems like using an LLM or like as just viewing it as another piece of software, and like how do we apply OpenTelemetry or observability to a piece of software, right?
Yeah, you
The
got it.
first I think is the huge grab bag for AI, but LLMs don't work in the like vast multidimensional data space, right? So like one of the big themes that where I see AI moving isn't actually training data at all, and it's not fine-tuning data at all. It's using existing vast pre-trained models and writing agents on top of them. Agentic AI seems to be the big player in the space at the moment, but that doesn't work for your own custom platform with multidimensional data,
No,
right? Is anyone training models on there?
so there are models. I mean, there's models all over the place. We've got models coming out of our ears at the moment. So there's several different repositories where you can look up different types of models that you can kind of try them out.
Right.
With different technologies. And generally, I recommend having a play with them because you need to look at your data and you also need to look at the types of questions people are going to ask it to validate a model is going to work for you. So
Right.
checking out repos like Hugging Face, Olama, all these other places, looking at the model cards, seeing if you can host it or which services you've got to use. All of these things are important when it comes to picking a model. And then also sitting it on top of your proprietary data. There are several different types of models that are not general purpose, that are for specific domains. So Bloomberg, for example, trained their own large language model that deals with financial data. I think it's called Bloomberg GPT. And there's several other ones that are applied to other domains like legal, medical, etc. So if you're using large language models generally, you might also want to look at the domain, i.e. financial services that we're working in, and find a model that's been trained on financial specific text, because otherwise it's not going to necessarily understand or apply the nomenclature and specific terms correctly. So it's a bit of a kind of choose your own adventure at the moment and see how you go. You still need to validate it like any other system or approach, but there's certainly things out there that we can play with in financial services.
Nice. Thank you. John, what's your adventure?
Well,
Not getting woken up at 4 a.m.
yeah, not anymore. AI is really good at process automation or improvement. So I just Googled AI incident manager, and everyone who's selling you incident management tools is now selling you AI incident management tools, of course. But Carly mentioned this idea of run books and following a process. If your organization has defined these processes, then AI is going to be great at doing it faster, better, more consistently. Where it's maybe going to struggle and you're not going to see return on investment of buying these tools is if you don't follow a process and you sort of play it by ear every time. So now we've got an incident type A, type B, type C, type D. Every time a new incident happens, it's a new type, and we're making it up as we go along. AI is probably not going to help you very much. You are getting the minimum value, but just looking at one of the websites for a vendor, it's using LLMs to tell you a nice story about what happened, and sure, that's useful if your organization places some value on having a nice story, but I'd argue actually the data underlying it and what you're going to do to fix the root cause, that's what really matters. And AI, I think is going to be a long way away from that, as anyone who's played with AI coding tools and complex problems will know. It'll authoritatively tell you that it's found the solution when it's talking total nonsense. When we get to that point, and maybe agentic systems are the way we get there, great, but I'm sure most, if not all of us, have been on an incident call where you get the expert on and you pivot from 20 minutes of panic and people throwing out all these suggestions to that person just coming on saying, that's the problem, do this, and it's fixed. It would be great to pull that institutional knowledge and expertise out of people's minds and codify it into systems, but I think we're quite a way away from it.
Is that not a cultural problem? Because that always reminds, I call it the Brett effect from that book, The Phoenix Project. You know, that idea of that expert that knows everything, but we've never pulled all the information out their head. They just get pulled into every single situation, and then we wonder why all their deliverables are so far behind.
Yeah, I've been Brett a few times. It's not much
Same.
fun.
It's not a fun place, no. You're always on every outage call.
Wouldn't we just spin up another Brett though?
Well, that's the promise of AI when it can finally deliver.
Sam, can I just add just one thing? Obviously, you've talked a lot about from the software side and development side. I think from an operational perspective, the enterprise-wide tools, and I mentioned one earlier, but there's also other tools out there like Logic Monitor. They're definitely investing a lot in terms of the AI ops space. And you've had, as Carly said, you've had the automatic anomaly detection for a long time. But that learning and that actually the data sets, because you're bringing the data now into one place from the multiple other tools, actually the AI is actually the operational side is actually getting better and better. And the alerting is much more configurable now. So, you know, you're not getting hit by everything, and the fatigue is starting to go away because you're able to actually make sense of what's going on. So I think that's where, you know, John mentioned we're a long way off, you know, where things are going to predict everything. But from an operational point of view, I see that with observability, yes, one tool is not going to fix, you know, we bought the tool, why are we not observable? That cannot happen. Or rather, it does, maybe it does, Sam, with your friend who's in that large bank. But I would say that for the operational people in whether infrastructure or support spaces, the tools, the enterprise-wide tools are getting better. Yes, you're going to be using some of the open source tools to get some of your data in. But as long as you're visualizing it in that, you know, that one control plane, I think the correlations there between all the tools, then you are going to get some better knowledge to hopefully be a bit more predictive. There's always going to be an outage that, you know, you have to follow up and add some extra monitoring or alerting in after the fact. But yeah, that's my sense.
And are you seeing rationalization of notifications and like at the consumer end, rationalization of what's happening across your enterprise?
So in terms of tools, yeah. So the whole obviously we had sprawl and fragmentation, and that's people have realized now that if you really want to achieve that observability, you do need to make sure that those tools talk to a central control plane. Otherwise, you know, you're still going to get your siloed monitoring and alerting. And ultimately, if you are codifying all this and it's in your pipelines, you know, you're deploying your monitoring, you know, de facto as your changes go out, which controls it so much more now.
And so to stay on that theme and to stay with you, James, how do you manage that observability across multiple environments? Potentially acquisitions is a huge course of kind of tooling fracture, different systems, new systems, and legacy systems. How do you begin to manage messaging and notification?
So I talked about one of the things just then, the single pane of glass. So what does unification mean for you? So a single pane of glass, standardized metrics, logs and traces. I'd say you've got to have a framework. So an observability framework would be standard instrumentation. So obviously where your developers know what they should be emitting from their logs. We talked about the OpenTel piece. I'm not going to go into that, but I think the consolidation of data collection as well. obviously you might use multiple tools to collect, but as long as you're putting it into one place at the end that you've correlated on, then that should be your control plane. And then centralizing your analysis, and we've talked about visualization. So you might want a lakehouse or a Elasticsearch. Obviously, you can do that to aggregate your data. And then the governance. We talked about we talked about culture. I think the naming, tagging, and all this piece, has to be part of your DNA with the developers and the support staff. Otherwise, you're just not going to get there. It has to be controlled. So there has to be some governance, and then people need to know about dashboards that they can use as well. Observability champions. We didn't talk about that in the culture piece, but I guess you probably would want to have that in a larger organization. What else? We'd probably regularly review, and you talked about fragmentation of tools. There are going to be some that become redundant. And if you can start using OpenTel, then you're going to be able to centralize a lot and then just hook that into one bigger control plane or one big visualization layer. We've got an example where we've got in my organization in the Middle East where we had lots of great infrastructure monitoring tools, so SolarWinds, you might know, from a networking perspective, and actually we didn't want to reinvent those the alerts in Dynatrace. We actually just diverted them to Dynatrace, but at least we had then the relevant metrics. SolarWinds did all the clever work around what networking metrics were right to monitor, and then we just visualized it, and we could then filter on that in Dynatrace. So actually, you don't always solve all the problems from one tool, and you might need a few tools, but as long as you can centralize it in the end.
Fantastic. Thanks for the insight there. We're coming up on the hour, and I want to respect people's time. So I think if we just go around the panel and ask for some final thoughts about what the near future looks like in the observability space, then we can hand over for maybe a couple of questions. John, then Carly, then James.
Predicting the future is always a challenge. I'd probably go more with hopes and dreams rather than predictions, that people start to understand the value of doing this and put it in sooner. So shifting left is probably not the right phrase for it, but don't put the observability in at the end. It's just as important as the business logic that you're writing. It's like you put all of this time and effort into the magic bit of functionality that's going to make you loads of money. You probably want to keep an eye on how long it took to make that money.
Thanks, John. Carly, from you.
Yeah, so I think there's more focus on things like, observability as code, because a lot of the tools are still a little bit like UI heavy. So I see more of that coming through. I also think other tools will become a bigger player in the space on top of OpenTelemetry. So profiling in particular, which we've not really talked about today, is something that I think is potentially going to be a new signal type eventually that we'll end up talking with. And then also client instrumentation. I think we haven't really talked about that as well, but as a front-end engineer, you need to think about different custom metrics when it comes to front-end and UI and integrate those with the other types of signals that you've got. So I see kind of more of a standardization in that space happening eventually too, because at the moment it's very disparate RUM agents that tend to take care of that.
Right, all right. Thank you, Carly. James, and then also, James, I'd like you to weave into your answer the question in the chat. How do you make sure metrics remain relevant and don't get gamed?
I might leave John for that one, but I'll start on kind of, I guess, start with the business problem or challenge. I've talked about minimize the tooling collection. Minimize the tooling and make sure your collection and aggregation and visualization of data is simpler. We talked about developers instrumenting code. I think that's very important, and that shift left piece. Invest in the process. If you want to embed it as a culture, you've got to invest in the process, and people along all the chains need to understand that. And then if you get it right, I think you should start to be more proactive, definitely a bit more predictive. It would hopefully reduce your mean time to resolve. And And I think there was something someone said about high-performing organizations. They measure what matters. They collaborate, which you have to do across all these different populations of data, and they optimize the data. So they don't ingest. They might ingest a lot, but they don't probably query everything, and prioritize root cause over system detection. I guess finishing with that.
Okay, thanks, James. John, you've been pointed at.
So relevancy is a challenge. I think thinking back to dashboards and metrics that make their way into these systems very quickly seems to be that you've got a dashboard, and if you imagine it's got 4 things on it, everybody ignores 3 of them and only looks at one. You've got to treat your support tools with the same sort of love and resource allocation that you give the rest of the whole of your system, if you like. And gaming those metrics, it reminded me of this story about Amazon and Jeff Bezos when they were monitoring as a KPI how long it took their support folks to answer a phone call. And it looked great, and people were emailing Jeff Bezos and saying it was rubbish. So apparently in a meeting, he just rang the number and it stayed on hold for 12 minutes or something. And they were tracking the amount of time that it took between someone picking up the phone and resolving the problem. So that is unintentional gaming at its finest. You've got to avoid that, where your metrics are saying everything's fine and your users are telling you it's on fire. But it's less about gaming it and more having good intentions and not quite getting it right, which I'd just describe as a bug, like any other piece of software. You tried, you found something wrong with it, you fix it, and it keeps getting better.
Thanks, John, and thanks, Ricardo, for the question. I'm going to hand back to Barry now because we're at the top of the hour, but before that, I'm going to jump in with my answer to the question, which is to James's point. If we are tracking as our metrics business flows, then gaming the metrics simply means doing more business. There we go. Barry, over to you. Thanks very much to our panel, and thanks to everyone for joining us. I've been Sam Moorhouse, your host, and over to Barry Cranford.
Yeah, wonderful line to finish on there, Sam. Guys, thank you so much for coming. Of course, thank you to the hosts, James, John, and Carly. Thanks, Sam, for running it. I've just put that link in the chat again. Feel free to click it quickly because it will go in about 10 seconds. If you want to connect with anyone else that's been here, the panelists, Sam, myself, or each other, please put your LinkedIn down there. Like we always say, the point of these things is bringing people together. It's starting conversations. There's only so much you can get through in an hour. I know I speak on behalf of all the panelists when I say they'll all be happy to be approached afterwards with connections, any further questions or anything. So very quickly, a few more seconds to click that link if you want to follow up, and hope you can join us for the next one. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the sun.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.